Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 57. For the audio listeners, you are missing actually a pretty historic set of images on your screen right now. We have Keith Jackewicz and Laura Woods together on the first show together with me at any rate. And we're all wearing actually red shirts. Well, I'm wearing red. I had to turn up the light so it doesn't look orange. I was wearing this like disgusting white t-shirt and I just decided, you know what? If Laura shows up on the call and she's like dressed nicely, I'm going to have to change my shirt a little bit. So we're kind of matching. And interestingly enough, I don't know if it's because it's the cover of Antony and Cleopatra, which is, by the way, what we're discussing here, but I've always associated the color red with this play. I first read it maybe about 15 years ago. I mentioned how W.H. Auden, he had this collection of I guess like, selected, not his selected poems, but poetry that he would curate. And for whatever reason, it intrigued me that he, of all of Shakespeare's plays, he decided to include Antony and Cleopatra as the thing for people to read. And I'm guessing now that after having read it, I can sort of see why it's very underappreciated. It's very like underperformed. In fact, when I was looking for just performances of the play, the only thing I found was the 1974 Patrick Stewart version, which has some interesting details just in as much as it cuts certain things and it leaves certain things. Some of those cuts made sense, other ones perhaps didn't. But we could talk about all of that. So maybe you could just like jump into your reactions to this play. The fact that it does seem to be underappreciated. What were your responses?
So yeah, it was actually was my first time reading it. Well, I've read it like a couple times to prepare for this now. And yeah, I think like I was just saying, like I'm not going to claim to be a massive Shakespeare buff. I still haven't read all of his plays. I've read most of the tragedies anyways. And like I was actually very probably because this is so underrated, it's not when you tend to see the same five or so being mentioned, like Othello, Hamlet, King Lear, a couple of others, and it's like the Tempest, and like this isn't one you kind of see mentioned up there quite as much. And I do think it's a lot. I do think it's underrated. I think it's a lot tighter in some ways, despite it's like I'd say fairly lengthy, but the pacing, like compared to like some of Shakespeare's other plays, like it's a lot tighter in terms of the pacing. It kind of breezes by. There's like it's kind of interesting. One of the like things I read when I was doing a little bit of background reading was somebody I seen some scholar pointing out that there's a lot of these once you get into the third act or so, there's a lot of these like short little scenes to kind of like set the scene and progress it. And it's almost kind of like you could see in terms of like a TV show or a film, that kind of like way of like quick cutting between scenes more so than what might have been typical in a lot of plays. And I do think there's something to that. Maybe it was just a little before its time in terms of like those kind of things. But yeah, it's I did. It was quite like an interesting experience. I'd say I definitely put it up there as one of like the better Shakespeare plays I've read overall.
In terms of also, I think especially for the size, right? Because I don't think it's longer than King Lear, for instance, but King Lear
No.
has a lot of excess anyway.
Yeah, it's a
Where
lot. I think one of the things is it doesn't really have any of these like bullshit kind of B plots going on that
Mhm,
like a lot of
mhm.
like Shakespeare's plays. I feel like that takes up a lot of space and like you just like a lot of the time his side characters are not especially interesting or they're just there for like bad comic relief or whatever. But like this play actually doesn't really have much of that. Like even when there's like some relatively short scenes to set like some of the political action, it's like relatively tight. There's not, it kind of breezes by. You could easily like trim it if you wanted to as a director, I'd imagine, but also like it just kind of clips by at a decent pace. There's also like a fair amount there that like an actor I'd imagine could do with that as well. In terms of the side characters, they're not quite as cardboard cut out. There's like some interesting little details I can imagine you could exploit here and there
Mhm.
that not all of his plays have, because like even in yeah like King Lear or even Hamlet you have um fuck I'm trying to remember what's like his two friends that come and you have like all these scenes and his two friends that come or like you always have these like characters that are just so like plot devices or like bad comic relief or just there to kind of have like the representation of the plebs or the peasants, but they're not especially like you know, given a lot of dignity compared to the main ones. Whereas like I found even in this, a lot of the side characters are given a little more depth than in most of Shakespeare's plays. Like you have like a number of like the soldiers and courtiers and that are kind of interesting in their own right. So
Yeah, and like in terms of those little details from side characters, to the extent that it has humor, it's much more kind of like, to get back to Hamlet, there's a kind of like a dark humor that emerges,
yeah, they're kind
getting
of
to a nunnery,
comedy.
that kind of stuff. And here too, like there's a lot of like sexual innuendo
Yeah.
that's brought, like when I was, there's like, you can make criticisms of the Patrick Stewart version of this, but at the same time, like they do capture some of that innuendo quite a bit. And there's always like a grimness and a darkness to it, especially since, and maybe we could like discuss this in a bit, but how we modern readers will be perceiving the play versus how
They would have at the
people in
time.
Shakespeare's time, or even like Shakespeare's intentions versus what the final effect is, because
Yeah.
there's a transformations, like if you have great art, that tend to happen even if it's like totally outside the hands of Shakespeare, even if it's like outside of his intentions, still like the fact that the changes occur, I think, speak to the quality of the work.
There's like a kind of meta aspect that comes up more and more as the play goes on, where like
Mhm.
there's this consciousness, especially on Cleopatra's part, of like how they're going to be viewed. You have this, like, she gives her kind of soliloquy about like they're like how, she like imagining this like a shitty play being performed and mocking her and Mark Antony and all this. And like you kind of have that like aspect where like you'll have a few servants in the background watching it, and they'd be like, oh, like there's one point, and I don't have the quote there, but it's to the effect of like, it's great to be able to just watch this, not take any part in it, and kind of just stand there mocking it. So there is this kind of like meta aspect that's like not hammered in too much, but it just kind of comes out here and there, and it's quite nicely done.
In terms of my own relationship to the play, I first read it maybe 12 or 13 years ago. I think I talked about this when we read The Tempest, or when we talked about The Tempest. But when I was in college, I was studying theater, and I just at one point decided to buckle down, and I spent like 3 or 4 weeks just reading Shakespeare constantly, just going through the entire collected works, and just so I could say that I had done it and that I was at least a little bit familiar with everything. And I remember at the time, this was especially when you read everything that he wrote and you read this one, it really does stand out because there are just so many scenes in this compared to a lot of his other plays. I mean, it really does
Mhm.
jump around quite a bit. So there is like Laura said, a briskness to the pacing that you don't get in a lot of his other plays. And also it's a lot more, in some ways it's like his least self-conventional play, or at least one of his like least self-conventional play, because it doesn't really have a traditional Shakespearean villain, someone that is like
Mm.
on the sidelines plotting, talking to the audience, explaining his machinations. The antagonist is, I guess you could say, Octavius, but he's not really shown as being an especially bad or loathsome kind of guy. I mean, he's just one of the people that is vying for power, and his claim is not necessarily worse than Mark Antony's. And you're watching most of this from Antony and Cleopatra's perspective, and so I guess you're ostensibly on their side, but they're not shown as being especially more virtuous than the people that they are tangling with. So
If there's a villain here, it's Mark Antony's midlife crisis, essentially.
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, the
To the
closest I
point.
guess is like the Lepidus character, because he's kind of a flatterer, he's trying to
Mm.
keep both of these people in the position that he wants them in order to preserve his own power, but he dies off, or he goes away off screen. So he doesn't even really get much of a traditional denouement to him. But also speaking as someone who has like performed in Shakespeare plays in the past, I remember thinking that this would be a challenging play to do for a modern theater troupe or whatever, because it really does jump around so much. And unless you wanted to, I mean, in Shakespeare's time, you probably could just have like four sets, like here's Rome, here's Cleopatra's palace in Egypt, here's a third place, here's a fourth place, and just very minimal set dressing, and maybe more like elaborate costumes that they would just have in stock because they were doing plays all the time where it takes place in Egypt, takes place in Rome or whatever. But to do this in a way that a modern audience could really follow, because it is quite heavy with a lot of the classical allusions that it makes, both in terms of the actual history that it's dealing with, as well as references to epic poetry of the time. I mean, you'll read people talk about how there's significant recourse to the Aeneid in this play. And, you know, in order to get people to basically kind of follow what Shakespeare was doing here, I think you'd have to do pretty like elaborate set design and costuming and things like that. So that might explain why it's not done as often. But it really does stand out as a very interesting and quite good piece of his corpus on balance.
One thing that I noticed, well, first of all, like to your point about the lack of a true villain, what you said about that after, which was, well, you know, we kind of see this from the perspective mostly of Antony and Cleopatra, so we do kind of root for them. Whereas, like if you were just sort of like, you know, reading Julius Caesar first, right? Antony is definitely more of a villain there. You know, his like manipulations and whatnot. So here you're presented somebody that I'm not sure if the word is like you root for him, because he definitely does have these like very negative qualities, right? Like Octavius Caesar, later Augustus, is accusing him essentially of being kind of like, you know, too soft and effeminate, and, you know, too interested in the machinations of Egypt, right? Like historically, there was the whole big blow up over the Alexandrian donations, which is basically like, you know, Octavius is reading out the will of Antony, or maybe it wasn't a will, it was maybe some proclamation where, you know, he's ready to leave you know, his own property in Rome, and also these like new conquests to the children that he has with Cleopatra. He had like, I think, 3 kids with her, but still, like there is this kind of odd thing where you do stay in his side a little bit, even though outside of like this, you know, love that they have towards one another, which maybe you could identify with a little bit, but it's not the kind of love that anybody would associate really, you know, if you're like an adult, I guess, you probably wouldn't associate it with something too positive, right? I mean, you're sort of like told to like how to think about it, you know, from the very beginning. Like the opening is essentially, you know, like Antony's people saying that this is an acceptable behavior, right? So Philo says, "Nay, but this dotage of our generals overflows the measure. Those his goodly eyes that over the files and musters of the war have glowed like plated Mars, now bend, now turn the office and devotion of their view upon a tawny front." Right, tawny being like the description of Cleopatra, which is another odd little thing. I mean, I think it was even well known during the time of Shakespeare that Cleopatra, she was not black, she was not African, right? Her descent specifically was Macedonian. And, you know, people would sort of they would have that knowledge, but still there's a lot of like this sort of Orientalist playing around, which is kind of necessary. Like if you think about how we set up, you know, the conflicts and what Egypt might represent, what Rome might represent, right? And he continues, "His captain's heart, which in the scuffles of great flights hath burst the buckles on his breast, reneges all temper, and has become the bellows and the fan to cool a gypsy's lust," right? And the word gypsy also has like some origin, I believe, with Egyptian. This idea that, again, like this is somebody that's very different, very other. So like, what do you think about this whole idea that, you know, you're not really made to really sympathize with Antony or even like root for him in a classical way, but still you sort of do, and yet still like intellectually, it's, you know, it's this like conflict like between the emotion and the intellect in the whole play, which is this idea that, you know, what Antony is doing, whether he gets like the second wind or the new courage or whatnot, all that is based not on reason. It's just based on some sort of like, you know, emotional investment that he has that will really damage him. And I want to get into some of those passages later that really develop that, which is, you know, like another good thing about the play is just how you could like skip to like any page and you're probably going to find a ton of like really nice lines, very nice descriptions. It's really kind of like overfilled with that. So I don't even know what I'm asking now. Like, I guess guys respond or say something else.
It's historically interesting because I mean, we now know from cognitive psychology research that racial recognition is something that emerges at like a very young age in people. You know, I think even infants as young as like 1 to 2 months, they can recognize people that they share like a racial grouping with preferentially versus somebody that they don't. But at the same time, like race as we understand it today is something that was like really kind of fine, you know, it was being actively constructed at the time that Shakespeare wrote this play. So it is in some ways like Shakespeare grappling with something that is like starting to emerge or starting to crystallize and really harden in his society. And so I mean, it's interesting to see that it was already at a point in this play where it could you know, be utilized in this way, but it wasn't, you know, it's sort of it's ambiguous and soft. It's not like this
I
hard
mean,
thing like this African wench that has you know, tempted this white man away from the glory that was due him or something like that. It's sort of this it's an abused term nowadays, but this sort of like liminal space that they both kind of step across, you know, in the both of them. So but in terms of the lines, what I wanted to say was the interesting thing about this play, the you know, is that there's really not a great soliloquy that you're like something that stands out as like, oh, you could just like break this out and it's a good poem on its own. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that there are segments, but there's nothing like to be or not to be or tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow from Macbeth or things like that. It's the line, the good and memorable lines and twists and things like that are more evenly dispersed across the play instead of sort of concentrated in one big speech, either to a character or to the audience.
yeah, I think regarding the racial thing, I think it's like, you know, they don't at his time, like they wouldn't have had that understanding, but like I mean, there was still with regard to like the British, like, you know, colonial interests and stuff like that, there
Mhm.
would have been this like very much like an understanding of how to other a group that you wanted to place beneath you or to kind of
Mhm.
like derogate in some way. So it's like, which is kind of like it's a separate a bit of it's a tribalism, but it's a bit of a separate thing from like what like nowadays gets discussed in terms of race, especially that in a quite Americanized lens on things. So like you know, like it's very much like it's a thing they can just like use and weaponize to other it because it's sort of like, well, you know, they look down on it's like you already have this trace of orientalizing and stuff that are kind of like separate really from whether or not, you know, you do have these references to, you know, her tawny skin or whatever, but that's kind of just like here or there, and that could just well refer to like, you know, a suntan or something. I think there's some like reference like Cleopatra makes in it or something to herself in that regard. But it's more so it's quite reminiscent of like orientalizing attitude in terms of like Egypt is like this decadent sensual kind of thing where they all just sit around like drinking and having feasts and having sex and enjoying themselves. And then Rome is very martial and straight to the point. And you know, you go to the Roman scenes where like they're just kind of discussing this politics and they're very straightforward. There's this tension, this briskness, and then you go and then like straight after, especially in the first couple of acts, there'll be a scene where you're going back to Cleopatra and she's just there like bantering with her like her handmaidens and her eunuchs and kind of like it's all very casual. And I think that goes back to what Alex was saying about how, you know, intellectually, like you don't really want to sympathize with a lot of the decisions that like Mark Antony or even that Cleopatra makes. You can go like they fuck up in a lot of ways. But I think a lot of the reason why you might sort of enjoy watching them a bit more or appreciate a bit more is because like when you see the way Egypt was represented, it's just a lot more fun. And I imagine there's a lot that like a director could do to play with that in terms of scene set, like in terms of the scenery, in terms of lighting, in terms of stuff like that, to present this kind of very soft, lush, sensual world that's kind of been placed on offer. And then even when you have, you know, in the Roman scenes, when you have Egypt being mentioned, it's always presented in this way. Like you have it's in one of the like scenes there where you have one of the soldiers in Barba's talking, and it's like, you know, he'll talk in prose when it's just these functional things, and then he goes into probably one of the more famous kind of like speeches, although it's, like, I'd agree it's not on the level of like any of the great soliloquies in the other play, the one where he's talking about when Mark Antony first came to Egypt and saw Cleopatra on the barge, and you have this like very lush description that's like that's just a huge contrast to the earlier, more prosaic and literally written in prose kind of proclamations that are made earlier in that scene. So you kind of have a lot of these devices being very obviously used that are just, yeah, they're just more, it just all presents, this is fun, this is enjoyable, this is sensual, this is, you know, enjoyment compared to plain and brisk and martial and practical, and we do what we have to do, Roman. Like, it's kind of hard not to root for them a little bit when they're just like in this little fantasy world, and then you have, you know, Caesar coming in and effectively ruining that with real world concerns. So yeah, I think that's probably a lot of why you do end up rooting for them a little bit, despite them both being incredibly flawed characters and people.
Well, they're, especially for an audience, I mean, part of like elite duty in Shakespeare, for lack of a better term, is a certain virtuousness and forbearance that you have to cultivate that sort of separates you from the average person.
It's the idea that, you know, you have all these perks, but you have a responsibility then as a result of them.
Yeah, I think at one point they're describing like a party that they had, and somebody said, I heard you guys roasted 8 boars for a party of
12 people, yeah.
Which I thought was so funny. It's like,
and he was like, no, it was actually, and then he replies,
he's like, no, it was actually even crazier
more than that. You heard it wrong.
Yeah,
it's very, and it's just kind of, it's kind of, you have that whole thing, and then there's a lot done too with like, so it's like to that exotifying kind of thing, but you can't help but, you know, it's at the same time, it's not presented negatively for all that. Like some of the characters, like Caesar views it negatively. Many of the like Roman soldiers view it negatively, but like in terms of the way it's being framed in the narrative, it's really not being presented in a negative light at all. You can very much see the appeal.
Yeah. And well, also, I mean, you have to remember Shakespeare is typically dated as being like a part of Renaissance writing or whatever. And obviously that was sort of that's both a post facto term applied by cultural historians, although it was a little bit self-conscious with like Petrarch, you know, sort of understanding himself as being part of a new era that's emerging from the Dark Ages or whatever. But I mean, to the extent that there's like a founding moment of the Renaissance or whatever, it's often described in terms of the fall of Constantinople to the House of Islam in the 1400s. And that's when you get this like exodus of Christians west, as well as a lot of the Roman and Greek materials that were still central to Eastern Roman Empire culture, making their way back over to Europe, and this renewed scholarly and elite interest in those kinds of works. And so, and about 150 years later, you get Edward Gibbon writing the fall of the Roman, or the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and he doesn't really take any interest in the Eastern Roman Empire at all, because he sees it as this like effeminate, Asiatic, decadent sort of like fallen version of Rome, doesn't even speak Latin, you know. And I do think that was, I mean, that was his own choice not to deal with that, but this perspective of Rome as having fallen because it was getting too interested in these sort of like decadent Eastern lifeways and luxuries is something that had been in Europe for a long time. So when you're suddenly, you know, dealing with this newly revitalized interest in classical architecture and literature and things like that, I mean, you can sort of, I mean, you can see Shakespeare looking at this as like sort of the like a microcosm of that, you know, like on the one hand, you know, these are luxuries that anybody could be tempted by, you know, but look at what happens when you give yourself over to them, you know, look at the look at the outcome. You are putting yourself on the wrong side of fortune because fortune favors the like the stern and somewhat less passionate man that is willing to do what needs to be done, you know.
And that racial element that I alluded to before, to build on what you're just saying, I'm not sure how well known this would have been in Shakespeare's time, but definitely during the time of Rome, there was a lot of kind of like what we would expect, similar to today, like conflicts like between the native populations and migrants. And for a while, like there was a lot of like nationalistic sort of, jingoistic rhetoric coming out of Rome. I remember like one time, like there was this, I forget who wrote this, but there was one Roman author that I was reading in college, because one of my majors in college was classics. And I remember it was very funny because he said something like, like these Greeks, right? They're capable of absolutely anything. And we're talking about, Greece from, the Alexandrian Greece, right? Like the whole kind of like after, after the time of, Pericles, after the time of Socrates, we're now, well, like aged into the time of Hellenistic sort of Greece. And this is the groups that they were looking at. They would say stuff like, these Greeks are capable of anything. And if you start shivering in front of them, they'll start shivering too. If you start saying that you're hot, watch them break out in a sweat. They could learn any language, they could do anything. Give them a few years, they'll come down to you and pick you up in a spaceship. I don't know what Latin term they translated for spaceship, but that's just kind of like the gist of the translation. And a lot of that was directed towards like, even like, what we would consider, to us, like, it's like, oh, this is Western culture. But at the time, Alexander the Great was considered this, Northern Greek, right? This like, Macedonian type, the tawny type, the one that's not like part of like mainstream Greek culture. And, he tries to acculturate himself with all the tutors and whatnot. And, this is partly, like some of the conflict, right? That's also being, aped and replicated in this play, right? It wouldn't surprise, like if I'm like reading some of the Roman propaganda at the time, like during the time of, these civil wars in Rome, like between whether it's like Antony or whether it's Caesar, like whoever, there's actually like a lot of like mutual propaganda coming out. And they're all, arguing from the direction of, like what is best for Rome. There was all this like stuff about the reason why we're having civil wars is there's this breakdown of morality. Right. Everybody's always talking about a breakdown of morality. And this is why,
the Romans are always on that shit, man.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Like you can read Romans from like 400 BC that are concerned about like degeneracy and decline of virtue and morality. And it's like a running theme basically until there's not any more Romans. It just goes on and on and on.
And I remember like it, but if you're like a modern reader looking through all this, I remember like when I was first learning Roman history, like I was waiting for like to hit like the golden age and what that really was supposed to look like. Okay, well, finally, plebeians are able to be, part of the political equation. And we have, I think, the first consul from the plebeians sometime in maybe the 200s or the 300s BCE. And it's like, all right, so we're sort of getting there, but it still is like kind of backwards, and there's still these kinds of wars, and you're just waiting for that kind of, peace. But the time you get to the peace, you already have the Roman Empire, and you have like essentially, the democracy is more or less kind of a figurehead, right? The Senate is, I don't know all the specifics, but the Senate was just kind of like almost a perfunctory sort of thing at that time. So it's very odd where you never really reach the time where, like, oh, this is what they meant by the golden age. And it's not what we would consider to be a golden age. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, even the democracy was not a democracy. It was an oligarchy. It was
you keep reading, you keep
property and wealthy classes can vote.
You keep waiting to get to the thing that everybody just jerks off about, like, oh my God, ancient fucking Rome, oh my God. And like you never actually hit it. You never actually find that thing that everybody's so into. So it is odd, but anyway.
Yeah. Ain't no golden age in Antony and Cleopatra, I'll say that much. Those Romans
actually,
are
kind of related to that, but on the more personal level. Like, I think it's like, I was just thinking while reading it there the other day, like it's an interesting narrative choice that like you hear so much about like Mark Antony, both his supposed golden age where he was this great soldier and he did all these like supposed great things. And I think you do get kind of one extended description of this from one of the Romans. And then you also then hear a lot about his time of all this decadent shit that he was doing in Egypt. But like you don't, I think it's a pretty good choice. You don't really see either of those two things. You just kind of see him in this like sort of dissipation. Like even in the first scene there where he comes in and he's just like doing all this, oh, I love you more. No, I love you more shit with Cleopatra. It's just like you just see him and he's just kind of like silly and ineffectual and at worst kind of erratic in the later scenes. Like you don't actually see him at either his height or his supposed downfall. You just see the aftermath of it. And I think that's actually a pretty good choice. Like it's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's not a lot of action in the play. Basically, all of the stuff that would be conventionally interesting kind of happens like off stage.
Yeah.
The decadence mostly happens off stage. The battles happen off stage. Like there's this whole extended scene where they make peace with the son of Pompey the Great, who famously was the one that tangled with Julius Caesar, Sextus Pompeius, his son. You know, there's this extended scene on the boat, and he has a servant try to convince him that he should, you know, cut the ties and sail off into the Mediterranean and kill these three triumvirs, and he should then become the leader of Rome. And he says, well, you know, if you had just done that without telling me, I could take, you know, I could disavow it, but also reap the benefits. But since you told me, you know, I can't do it. That's not honorable. It would be too dishonorable. And then he ends up getting screwed off stage. Like, I think it's between Act 2 and 3.
Yeah. It's barely mentioned either. Like you're just
he goes away. Lepidus is suddenly arrested off stage. Both the battle where Mark Antony loses happens off stage, and then the battle where he wins happens off stage, and then the third or the second or third betrayal where the Egyptians go over to Octavian's side, that happens off stage too. You know, you don't really see the greatness of these men is not in what we see of them on stage. It's really more constituted through the perceptions of them that we get through their top advisors as well as their underlings. You know, it's something that is constructed by the common perception of them and not something that we ever really see them get to embody in some kind of full way on the stage for us, the audience.
Yeah, there's actually kind of an interesting I think that thing of the reputation or the construct of that is like something that more and more kind of comes to the forefront, like as a conscious thing that's discussed by the characters. Like one of the things I did note was like, so it's Act 3, Scene 1, like that's kind of after this time skip where a lot of that shit happens. Lepidus is fucked over, Pompey's fucked over. You have one of the Roman soldiers, Ventidius, that was sent to Parthia to like stop whatever rebellion was going on there. And he like outright says kind of like, you know, I'm not going to read it, but to paraphrase that, you know, like he is just a lowly soldier. He could do more for, you know, in service of Antony or of Caesar. If he wanted to, he could do more, but then that would make them look bad. So it's not really what they want. It's like, it's in essence that like, you know, it's whatever was best serves their reputation more so than whatever best serves like actually conquering more places, you know, get it, you know, all of this, like achieving more victories and that. So it's interesting. So like I could do more to do Antonius good, but 'twould offend him, and in his offense should my performance perish. So I think like this kind of like, which it's just an interesting little detail because there's a character that only appears in this scene and never again. And it's kind of one of those like little scene, like brisk scenes in it that exists just to kind of let you know, oh, this has happened off stage, blah, blah, blah. But like you kind of do have this interesting like delving into this, which is it's quite a true observation, like as an underling or as some beneath it. But it also does kind of play into that fact of what you're kind of seeing in essence now of like, you know, like, in this play at least, none of their achievements themselves really matter. It just matters that they're believed to have achieved them, and this reflects on them for better or worse throughout the play.
Well, what do you guys think in general of the strategy to elide, you know, all this kind of action? Because I actually agree with Keith, like when you said that all we get essentially is these like public perceptions, which I think is a very good way and a very kind of innovative way. Like, assuming, like when this play was written, I mean, just like think back to the kind of stuff that was in the ether at the time. And then you get a play like this where the important part is the fact that they are just kind of raised essentially as symbols and as, objects of perception. Like I don't know to what extent the public would have really understood or known too much about the backstory of what's really going on in Rome at the time. I mean, like in this conversation, I'm gonna like keep providing some of those like historical details, but I wonder, like, without having the historical details and you're just coming across these names for the first time, you don't get to see the battles, you don't get to see this kind of external drama happening, and it's mostly an internal drama, right? It's people kind of essentially facing off against themselves, because to the extent that they're not appropriately facing off against themselves, that gets them into that external trouble of actually losing, right? For instance, like being too emotional. So like, what do you think about that as a writing strategy? Like, we're going to just, lift everybody up to, objects of perception. We're going to keep everything else off stage. Like, do you think that would work, or do you really think like you do need some level of historical grounding here to appreciate it?
Honestly, like I definitely have a lot less historical grounding than either of you do. I'm not really like that knowledgeable when it comes to classics. Like I have a vague idea of the history here, but like not that much at all. Like,
well, we're guys. We're legally required to do a lot of
yeah, we got to talk about Rome. Sorry. That's actually why we wanted you on this show, right? Because you have to bring back that other kind of energy here, right? Yes.
I'm honored. But yeah, I didn't really, and to be honest, like I found maybe because of that, like I found myself more focused on that aspect, which is like it's very modern in a way. Like I think it's like, this is obviously something like Shakespeare couldn't have realized, but I think like more so than his other plays, right, there is something very modern about that focus on like the like reputation and public image and all that, and as well these sort of almost like proto meta kind of like which he'll do in a lot of his plays. Like he'll have like references to the idea of being a stage and all the world's a stage and so on, but like it's kind of like really laid on, it's like referenced a lot here, and also it is something that's very much part of the way the whole like story is being told. It's I found that aspect quite interesting. I found myself focusing more on, like, I think like there's the personal aspect as well. There's the fact that like not knowing all this stuff, you just kind of end up seeing like somebody who's you kind of end up just taking it for granted that, okay, this is what people think of this person. This is what people think of Mark Antony in it. But like also that he's just kind of, he also comes across as quite a pathetic figure, I think, throughout it. Like, like not knowing any of that. Like I think when I was doing a bit of reading for this, I came across, there was a little bit actually in my book that I have where I talked about some of the performances. It was just saying that, Cleopatra is kind of one of Shakespeare's greatest like female roles that like many actresses would want to play, whereas Mark Antony is not really like known to be this notable tragic hero. Maybe Keith can like weigh in on this or any knowledge, but like I can kind of see why. He's just somebody who's not very, like, as we see him on the page, he's not very heroic. He's kind of like, he's quite pathetic in a lot of scenes, especially later on, where he's just this dissipated man, and he's just this kind of, and like in a way that really outweighs all of the like earlier, like the stuff we get that before and after, where Caesar's like, oh, it's a real shame that Antony's doing all this. He's too great a man to be at this kind of thing, and like it's just like, well, like we're not actually that's completely outweighed and nearly obviated by what we're getting here.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But I don't think that's to the detriment of the play. I think it's actually it is an interesting choice, and I think it actually it lends something more to it.
Yeah, it's almost subversive. Like the person who people going in is going to think of as the tragic hero that you're going to be the downfall of. He dies in the fourth act. There's a whole another like 30 minutes of the play that happens after he dies, and
it's really like Cleopatra then who dominates that and kind of gets, like, when he kills himself. Also, he kills himself. Well, maybe I should wait
kill himself
for topics
properly.
chronologically, but he does it in such a like sorry, but pathetic kind of way as well, because like he basically tells one of his like soldiers to kill him. He's like he's like, I don't want to do that, kills himself, just not have stuff, and then kind of he's like finally like accepts, okay, I'm being a coward, and then kills himself. Whereas with Cleopatra, it's this much more grand affair, and it's like not just her killing herself to get out of this thing, but it's very much framed in terms of her taking this form of agency over her life and how she'd be perceived as she's there, like, you know, thinking about how if she has to go to Rome, how she's going to be perceived, how it's going to be framed, how she's going to have to watch this grand humiliation. Whereas like her killing herself is this, her kind of taking charge of her destiny, her agenda in that way. So it's, yeah, if there's any kind of like tragic hero in that, it is really very much her.
No, just one thing I was gonna say, the person who Shakespeare has with Mark Antony when he's trying to kill himself, who ends up killing himself rather than kill Mark Antony, is named Eros.
Yeah.
And so I won, like,
is there a bit of like symbolism?
I was gonna say, was he actually there historically, or was that intended symbolically on Shakespeare's part? Or I mean, I guess intention doesn't matter, but
he does have a few like scenes with that specific Eros character where his name is kind of used in some way where it does seem to be punning on it a little bit. Like you have the bit where he comes upon his armor and Cleopatra does instead, and it's like does seem that he's playing off the meaning of the name a little bit. So
because Eros,
if it wasn't made up on Shakespeare's part, it's kind of fortuitous, and it could very well have seen some name in some history and was like, oh, that's pretty good for my purposes here.
Yeah, that was all I had to add.
Well, what do you guys think of, I mean, she doesn't, I don't think she appears in any substantive way in terms of like having any lines or whatever, but Antony's wife,
Fulvia.
Yeah, Fulvia. So, you know, she, you know, in like historically, like in some respects, she's just kind of similar to Cleopatra in the sense that, you know, here's a woman that sort of like, you know, takes control in a somewhat unconventional way, conventional in terms of Egypt, and Fulvia's role in Rome was considered very out of the ordinary because, you know, when Antony was not in Rome, she was essentially, you know, doing a lot of the kind of machinations behind the scenes. She engineered or helped participate in, you know, any number of you know, like civil wars or, you know, getting people on Antony's side, right? There was this whole big thing with a land acquisition where, you know, Octavius's conflict with Antony was predicated partly on, okay, so what are we going to do now? Are we going to either give some land up to these soldiers that are craving it, or which means we have to like actually confiscate it from Roman towns, like literally like what ended up happening was like, you know, physical expulsions, or do we simply, you know, ignore that and keep the Senate on our side, right? Because the Senate does not really want to participate too much in, you know, rocking the boat too much there.
Well, the Senate are also the landlords too, so
exactly.
If land's getting confiscated, it's probably theirs.
Yeah, and Octavius ultimately decides, okay, we're going to actually confiscate the land because as bad as, you know, getting on the wrong side of the Senate might be, the fact is right now, you know, I need soldiers, I need men, and I need them to be happy. And Fulvia is sort of like behind the scenes trying to like as that's about to happen, she wants to make sure that, you know, it's like according to her timetable, like she wants to make sure that these confiscations and the land being doled out happens when Antony's also at the same time in Rome, so that Antony and Octavius can both take the credit for doing something that ultimately will be perceived as a popular thing to do. So she's, you know, she's very critical to this. And if you like read her biography, she's a very interesting fellow, but at the same time, she doesn't really play a substantial role in you know, in the play, like in terms of having lines. But like early on when there's like the news of Fulvia's death and Antony, this is in Act 1 Scene 2, right? So she dies pretty early, which means she cannot actually appear in the play. This is how he characterizes it. This is on around like line 135. There's a great spirit gone, thus did I desire it. What our contempts doth often hurl from us, we wish it ours again. The present pleasure, by revolution lowering, does become the opposite of itself. She's good being gone, the hand that could pluck her back that shoved her on. I must from this enchanting queen break off. 10,000 harms more than the ills I know my idleness doth hatch. I find that an interesting speech, partly because, first of all, the death is immediately, set side by side with like, I need to escape, right? I need to escape this other woman, Cleopatra. Maybe he has this idea in his head that, I could have mistreated Fulvia in various ways because Antony was like very well known as a womanizer, that kind of thing. But at the same time, she did for me the kinds of things that Cleopatra might be doing. But instead of maybe leading me to ruin like Cleopatra might, Fulvia was always looking out for my best interest. So what do you think about her presence, like as a kind of like a ghost in the play? Because, a lot of attention obviously is played on the presentation of Cleopatra, who she is, how she gets interpreted as being, very salacious and, this kind of like black hole of like sucking all the energy out and destroying great men and whatnot. But at the same time, like there's also like a feminist reading, or if you want to go there, for someone like Fulvia, that I think it's really kind of like under reported in the critical analyses that I saw of the play. So anybody wants to take away from that?
Yeah. To be honest, like even without, I find it interesting, like just like hearing the historical context there, because like even without knowing that, I kind of like thought it was interesting where you see at first, like he's kind of complaining about, oh, Fulvia's like doing all these things on my behalf, and it's, Caesar is getting kind of starting to get annoyed, blah, 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 sending him all the message. But it was like quite interesting that, like there is the sort of commonality with Cleopatra there in terms of being like, he's associated with these two women that are both have like their own amount of political power and their own kind of agendas in this way. And then there's a kind of a contrast when you have later when there's the marriage like kind of contract broached between Mark Antony and Caesar's sister Octavia, who is like, despite being actually in the play and having lines, is probably less of a presence than we get from like Fulvia in the brief time she's mentioned, because she's just there to be like, oh, she's the perfect like paragon of Roman womanhood and like is virtuous and proper, and Caesar loves her and is angry when Mark Antony fucks her over, but like that's it. She's just there, and like she's there to be kind of placed as this, oh, she's no Cleopatra. So like there is, I don't know about a feminist reading, but there is something like interesting being kind of like upheld there in terms of the way the play like depicts its women. Yeah, in the sense that like she's just like, at least there's something interesting or compelling enough about like the mentions of Fulvia that like there is like, it is sticks in your head despite her never actually appearing.
Yeah, I don't know if it's really I mean, when you're talking about a play from like 1607, anytime you get into like, oh, here's my feminist reading of it, you're potentially asking for trouble, because these concepts
we are asking for trouble.
Yeah,
indeed.
That's not how that, and I just mean like even like in terms of intellectual coherence, because this really is like you can't, I mean, it's a lens that was developed afterwards, obviously, but also like the way that women were viewed in antiquity was like more complex than just like, oh, they were pure objects of exchange or whatever, like women could be politically very influential even if they couldn't necessarily occupy the big office, like they could be the one that was actually doing most of the machinations, but they needed to have a man as the brand of their work or whatever, because they couldn't be the face of the brand. I mean, that's the interesting thing about like great men historically is they're not just and this is true of presidents nowadays too. It's not just the guy and the decisions they make. It's like the whole system of advisors and confidants and patronage networks and things like that underlie them. And while women couldn't be like the face of that very often, they could absolutely be the ones that were like making most of the decisions, especially if the guy was, more feckless or less ambitious or driven or whatever. But what I sort of get from Fulvia in this context is, she's a paragon of Romanness in that despite having been pushed to the side by her husband, she still has her eye on the ball. You know, she is going to war with Antony's cousin or Antony's brother, but then they decide to find a rapprochement and they decide to turn their weapons on Caesar for one reason or another. You know, so and if Antony were more of a paragon of Romanness, he would be able to appreciate that, but he's too caught up in this like Orientalist web
Egyptian
of decadence and
yeah.
luxury or whatever, which we never see, but it is purported to have happened. You know, so that's kind of the place that it serves. But it is interesting that we don't get the melodrama of her coming up and confronting him like, how dare you, you know, what you've done to me. Well, so on the one hand, it would maybe be nice to hear from her because she sounds like an interesting character, but in some ways she's more like it sticks in your brain more, like in terms of we're talking about Antony as like a somewhat pathetic and even, you know, quipped kind of figure, perhaps. You know, the fact that he can so easily let go of someone like that and get caught up in this, you know, in these pleasures of the flesh or whatever. I mean, it does tell you a lot about him, and maybe she sticks more in the mind as somebody that's only alluded to and that you don't really get independent access to.
I think as well as that, just to like, this is like a little bit of a tangent, but regarding like the whole like issue of like feminist lens or whatever, like I'm generally kind of against that, but I think like this kind of, I think one of the problems is you can very much like, I think this is a play where there's like interesting things to talk about regarding, you know, like it's like women and men and like, you know, sexual relationships and the masculine versus the feminine. But like, I just think, look, you don't have to look at it through a feminist lens or refer to it in this way to kind of like discuss like, or to look at a lot of the ways that's done, because it's very much, I think like it plays into the whole it's kind of a more broader thing. Like it very much plays into the whole exotifying of Egypt. Like nearly there's a sort of like many times throughout the Roman characters will they'll, you know, refer to Egypt and these like as being the something kind of effeminate and like, and all these kind of terms. They'll refer to it like associate with Cleopatra and these feminine wiles and this kind of existence. And they'll kind of refer to Mark Antony as being somehow like effeminized during his time there in comparison to the, you know, this martial Roman kind of like, you know, masculine kind of role, which is like, I do think there's like something interesting there to look at without necessarily having to like do, like you say, like a kind of intellectually incoherent, like feminist reading of it. Like it's more there. And I think like even like just regarding, you know, you have like a lot of times, so even in just that quote where you refer, like you have Antony referring to the news of Fulton's death, he says like, I must from this enchanting queen break off, like continually you see throughout it. And this kind of like escalates in Act 4 before his death, where he just refuses to take responsibility for his own actions in a way. Like, I think there's an interesting thing going on where he like continually like, well, you know, and the other character, Caesar also does, and, you know, Barbas does this as well. And like, you know, refers to Cleopatra as, you know, kind of having him whipped, being this manipulator behind the scenes, but he's very much she is manipulative, but he's very much making his own decisions, and you get the sense he's very happy to be manipulated. Like he very much could leave. It's very easy for him to go like, oh, you know, she's kind of forcing my hand to stay here, I couldn't do anything else. It's like it's just like somebody who's utterly refusing to take any responsibility for his own destiny. And it is kind of like maybe a little subversive in that way, like Keith said, like of the whole tragic hero thing, because, you know, there can be the sense of in a lot of Shakespeare's plays of like, you know, there being star-crossed or being destined, but like you outright see here, he's just making all the wrong choices continuously and refusing to do anything different. So yeah. Well, and I mean, as you can tell, like I'm not a fan of that in a person, but I think it's a very, very interesting dramatic choice. And I think it's probably why the play kind of does resonate, because it does explore, or it does like represent that type of person, that type of character in a way that's still quite recognizable, you know?
Yeah, well, but it's also probably why it's performed less, you know, because it's not exactly, you know, if you're plunking down $50 to go see Shakespeare in a theater or whatever, it's not necessarily what you expect out of Shakespeare. You know, you don't get that that grandiosity and virtuousness of the character and the beautiful speeches and whatnot. You don't get a lot of that stuff. You know, it's a lot more the depictions of a lot of the characters is a lot more granular, and you have to kind of follow it in order to really see what he's doing. And I mean, that's from a literary perspective very valuable, but from like a theatrical financial perspective, I could sort of see why that would maybe be, you know, this would be last in the rotation, you know, like, okay, we have to do this one because we've done every other one of the plays in the last few years or whatever. But, you know, in terms of like, it's a hard issue to talk about, because the fact of feminism as an extant discourse means that we can talk about a character like Cleopatra in a more interesting way than like a Victorian scholar of Shakespeare, who probably would read it purely in terms of Eastern feminine decadence, you know, corrupting this great man, you know.
Or even someone like T.S. Eliot, like was one I read, like some of his things.
Well, Victorian in spirit, that one, perhaps. But you know, with like the fact of feminism means that, because Cleopatra is an interesting character in this play, you know, you really, the thing that's fascinating about the play is that you really never quite get a sense of her, because like does she even really love Mark Antony? It's like hard to tell. There's a lot of
ambiguities there.
You know, there really is an ambivalence and an ambiguity to her character that, like, because feminism has been a thing and a discourse that has been in academia, you can talk about that. But, you know, at the same time, there is this, when you're doing these like various ismic analyses of a writer like Shakespeare, whether it's post-colonial or feminist or this or that, it becomes like, oh, here's why Shakespeare was actually doing what we would want him to do, you know, all along. You know, like he was like, Shakespeare was secretly woke. And that's really not the analysis. Like, that's not a fruitful way of reading a 500-year-old or a 400-year-old writer, you know, both in terms of like even just enjoying it for what it is, you know. You're really getting far away from something that could be like, I mean, art should enrich your life, you know. It's not just an object of intellectual abstract contemplation. It's also like, it's that fusion of like the intellect and the spiritual, you know. It's something that should, like, you should be able to draw some enrichment from.
It's somewhat of a trend as well. And like, again, this is getting a little off topic, but I think it's like relevant to maybe why something like this isn't. It's just like, like there probably has always been to some degree, but like there is very much consciously people who like just want art to present a mirror. Like, and you see this a lot. I know, I'm sure you're familiar with like the absolutely questionable, like, you know, Twitter discourse around this. And it's like, it tends to be like veiled under like this moralistic think of the children thing, but it's near like this like discourse over, oh, how should you represent a character drinking alcohol in your book? Is it okay to have them getting drunk? And like this kind of young adult like queer discourse, but like it's not just
young adult writers and readers.
Overt example of that, because they have the pretext of like, oh, we'll think of the children. But I also see this seeping out in general to when I talk with adults about supposed literature, and it's like, you know, like you can't want to present a mirror to you. That's just boring. It's solipsistic. It's like, why are you reading Shakespeare? Like, why are you, you know, it's this, like, why would you, I wouldn't want everyone to think like me or to be like me. I read this stuff, like, it's a communication. I want to see like, okay, how does he write this and represent these things in a way I would never consider to do?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's not even a mirror. It's like when Homer Simpson is looking in the mirror and he sees himself like all muscular and he's going like, you know, like, you know, because they don't want a mirror. They want like an aspirational draw,
filtered like Snapchat filter or something where you look in it.
Yeah. They want a moral snap. They want art to be represented through like a moral Snapchat filter. That's a great way of putting it. You know, it's like, and I mean, you pretty much, if you want to appreciate art at all, I would say you pretty much have to, like, I guess you have to maintain a sort of peripheral awareness of modern discourse around it, but you mostly just have to unplug from it, because we're not the internet, we're in a real bad place with the internet, and we haven't figured it out as a species yet. So until we do, the nature of discourse is just going to continually degrade and drag things down to I mean, for lack of a better term, the lowest common denominator of like who is the most bothered by it, who can make the most inflammatory remarks about something, and, you know, who the squeaky wheel gets the grease, as the cliche goes. And that's, you can't let yourself as someone who's interested in or producing art get dragged into that, because it's just gonna
An intellectual
it's a
dead
dead end,
end.
and it's like your consciousness of it and trying to play to it is just going to make whatever it is that you're doing or thinking worse. You know, it is. I mean, you have to maintain peripheral awareness, because there might be something that gets brought up that, you know, is actually interesting or worth reckoning with or whatever. But for the most part, it's just a posturing pissing contest. And young adult writers especially, but a lot of the readers too. They're just like, that's the most like psychotic and like fucked up space that I think I've ever seen.
If you check out if you check out like young adult Twitter or whatnot, you know, it's literally just full of adults kind of, you know, just jockeying for status and virtue signaling about who cares about children the most. I care about kids more than you do, because look at your fucking book and what you wrote. I would never, display this in front of children. I would never, put these racist ideas. And it's, we're not even talking about racist ideas. We're talking about whether or not, Mark Twain should be taught. But to get back to Fulia for a second. So like Keith mentioned the idea of like, token women being oftentimes, this time in history, tokens and essentially just kind of like, used as a means to an end. And with Fulvia specifically, like in both in the universe and the play, as well as, the real life Fulvia, basically her death is used as an occasion to, for Antony and Octavius to make up, right? In the play later on, like the death is like, all right, so we're going to essentially pin all these civil wars and whatnot upon her, right? And we could sort of, just push her to the wayside, which it's interesting also from a psychological standpoint. So to get back to the, the quote that I read when he says about her death, "Thus did I desire it. What our contempts doth often hurl from us, we wish it ours again." So it's not as if he's like unaware of what's going through his own head. It's not as if he's unaware of the fact that, he keeps trying to find, like ever escalating means of acquiring pleasure, right? New people, new variety, right? That whole famous thing about, Cleopatra, like presenting like varieties of, womanhood and experience.
That, like she never gets old, but, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
I think like there's definitely, it's like, both, like, to be honest, both Antony and Cleopatra just strike as very like narcissistic people, to put it in a modern sense. Like, and there's something there about the way it's like, it just does make it quite compelling to read as theater, because like I don't know, like I've met people who live their lives in that sense, where they have this like sense, often I'm skewed, of being watched and how people will react to them, and oftentimes it's a very skewed sense and they don't have an accurate idea of how people are viewing them, but it's this constant consciousness. And I feel like, this is maybe, it's not, written with maybe the level of psychological depth that you'd get in like, the 20th century onwards or 19th century onwards, even in terms of plays, but like it does kind of hit on some kind of aspect of that kind of person or that kind of psyche or whatever, that it does kind of make it quite interesting, like in the reasons you mentioned, like where there's this sense he's very conscious of how it's viewed, but like he's quite conscious of his own foibles, but like the show must go on, like, and he just kind of continues on with it. And then you have like just the next page on after that quote, he's talking to Enobarbus and he tells him of Fulvia's death, and he gets back, "Sir, give the gods a thankful sacrifice." And then this whole spiel about how essentially, when your wife dies, like it's giving you the chance to get something new and better, and to that, and in a very flippant kind of humorous way. And like, so it's like, "This grief is crowned with consolation. Your old smock brings forth a new petticoat. And indeed, the tears live in an onion that should water this sorrow." So it's like in this very jovial kind of way. And that's about the most he gets. And it's sort of like, this pretty much gives him, he just moves on after that. It's like, gives him permission to be like, okay, whatever. It's
so
pop it off.
So that reminds me, I actually wanted to bring up that scene where they're joking about the death, and also like I also want to touch on you mentioned that there's this ambivalence about whether or not Cleopatra actually loves Antony, because partly that's partly interesting because that specific aspect of the play, I can imagine both like the, older critics of the play, like if you look at writing, 1700s, 1800s, whatnot, they would use that as to say like, look, it's Cleopatra is that, Jordan B. Peterson, feminine chaos, right? She represents that disorder
bitch that exists as a symbol of what all the things that lead men astray from what they should
we were
be
talking
doing.
before you hopped on, like the way that someone like Jordan Peterson is like a fraud is that he's not pulling this play out and be like, young man,
he's never read it. He's never read it. No fucking way would he. I can't imagine him having, especially at this point in his life,
and it's
have
such a
the
fruit
attention
of Western
span.
culture too. It's such a like is there anything more Western culture than Shakespeare, and yet he's left this apple
it's
unplucked.
Shakespeare doing a play based on Roman history. Like it's like should be everything these guys basically like wank to. So like, but yes.
And so like when they're sort of like making light of Fulvia's death, when I was when I was reading it, but specifically also when I was watching it in the Patrick Stewart performance, and the way that they were laughing about it, it made me think, okay, so like it reminded me of my response to like when I first saw the MASH movie, and basically like so like in that movie, a modern viewer would probably look askance at everything that we would consider to be depictions of, if not war crimes, then like it's just like not the way that you should conduct yourself, like in the army, the way that the women got treated, right, in the sense of like they were essentially hazed in a very kind of masculine way and like a sexist way. But at the same time, I thought, okay, well, if in the 70s there was like less opportunity to be offended by it, and people just kind of found this to be like just humorous, at the same time, like that doesn't denigrate the film in 2024, because in 2024 you're watching it and you start thinking, well, you know what, it doesn't seem to me like these people are being presented like very well, even if in the 70s people might have been laughing at it.
Yeah.
Here, there might
still giving you a type of person and a type of reaction that, like it or not, exists.
Exactly. Well, it's a type of person. It's also a meta commentary on just kind of like the American army. Like, what the fuck are you doing in Vietnam to begin with?
Actually,
what is this like? What is this nonsense that you're getting up to? The characters like doing these like surgeries in places where they're not supposed to be, and not getting in trouble because like they have like a high enough reputation, or they know the right people. Now, same thing. It struck me like when I was watching the Patrick Stewart performance, where it's like we get a little like uncomfortable watching it, but at the same time, whatever Shakespeare might have felt, if there was like more to it than just like pure humor, it speaks to the greatness of a work of art, where like years and years later you have a very different response, and still the people within it are being characterized, still they're being contextualized by specifically these kinds of scenes. Like, did you guys notice like any of this as you were reading it?
Yeah, I think it's like you get given enough like richness. It's like, having like a fake like cubic zirconia, but it's placed in a solid gold like ring or something. So like it's kind of redeemed by the, I don't know. But like, it's kind of like it's redeemed by the context, because like you're given enough there that you can, rather than it being like the whole place just an example of this sort of like rather like flimsy, like shallow sort of view of the world, you can instead say, no, it's like actually presenting like a full character who just happens to have these sort of shitty views of the world. I think like a lot of like the ambiguity, or a lot of like the scenes of Cleopatra being honestly kind of fickle and impetuous, and like in a lot of ways she does represent or play out a certain like types of like female characteristics that like, you do, like the Jordan Peterson reference of like the feminine chaos. Yeah, she does kind of embody that. But at the same time, it's like when you do read some of the scenes. So like I'm looking now at just, here you have like the next scene after that, you have Cleopatra and her handmaidens, and she's there kind of looking for Antony. And then she's like, right, well, she says, see where he is, who's with him, what he does. I did not send you. If you find him sad, say on dancing. If in mirth, report that I am sudden sick, quick and return. And then you have this little exchange between her and Charmian, one of her handmaidens, who appears in it, and who's saying kind of, Madam, methinks if you did love him dearly, you do not hold the method to enforce the like from him. Cleopatra, what should I do and do not? in each thing given way, cross him in nothing. And Cleopatra replies with, thou teachest like a fool the way to lose him. So it's kind of, it is very much this sort of like, it's the kind of shit that like, yes, it is very much like a stereotype that like of kind of feminine manipulation and stuff like that. But like, you can't say it's not true to some degree that like there aren't women who play these sorts of games and that there's some
classic
that
negging,
kind of thing.
as they say.
Yeah.
What?
It's just classic pickup artistry, you know. You got
yeah, no, it really is. I mean,
it's
it's basically like you could have this exchange as an example of the kind of stuff like red pill guides do. You don't want to, you know, where they're like, don't be a like Cleopatra's basically like, don't be a simp, don't do all this shit. You know, you gotta fucking like play around a bit, and it's just it's a true thing about like human psychology, though, in a way. You know, it's kind of. And I think because of that, it does, and it's something that's true enough in terms of like, there are people who act this way. There are people who, like Cleopatra is, you know, she's impetuous and fickle, but she's not presented as someone who's stupid. She's quite willful. She's quite, in moments like that like conscious of like how to wield her power, especially then when you have these times of ambiguity of her like basically deciding to take the sort of sneaky deal that she's offered by Caesar to betray Antony. And it's just sort of, there's enough there to say that she's very conscious of what she's doing. Like she's very like, you know, it is a sort of, you know, she is a woman who had an uncommon amount of power at the time, and it is a sort of, I guess you could argue, feminine power that like, regardless of whether the real Cleopatra wielded that or not, like I've read some stuff talking about how she wasn't this like seductress, sexy type that she's often presented in pop culture. But I mean, like, I'm sure she had to have been aware of like how she would have been viewed as a woman and how that's going to affect things, and how maybe like to wield certain things like that in certain ways, even if she didn't do it to the extent that a portrayal like this shows.
Yeah,
but
well, I mean, she fucked the most powerful men in Rome 2 times in a row, you know. I mean, there has to have been some kind of consciousness on her part of like sexuality as like a political weapon that she had access to.
It seems to me like the more that you read about Cleopatra's life, like it definitely seems like the whole like sexual angle, like she has a son by Julius Caesar, she has 3 sons by Antony. A lot of it just struck me as, okay, so this is a female ruler. She she probably like cultivated a sense of charisma and whatnot. There was like, this infamous thing where she wasn't considered very beautiful, but she was just considered very personable, very charismatic, very witty, that sort of thing. But, using sex essentially as a means of survival, right? It's just a means of, whereas like men, they don't have to necessarily think of those terms. And to get back to the idea of like, Jordan Peterson.
Well, I mean, it's more the thing for a man, like at least for straight men, even if you wanted to, it's not viable for you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not even
like,
I mean, just think of
more so,
like historically what vulnerable of a position she was in. I mean, she is still technically the monarch of Egypt, but Egypt is slowly over time having any sense of autonomy like chipped away at it by the increasing centralizing power of Rome. And so to the extent that she has any position at all, it's by entangling herself with these powerful men of Rome and having sons by them. It's and so it's very I mean, that's not something that Shakespeare really gets into overtly, but if you were somebody who was kind of familiar with the history of this, that's certainly something that you would have to think about. Like what else was she going to do? She doesn't have an army that can stand up against the Roman army. She doesn't really have anything other than trying to, various social mechanisms to keep in favor of the powerful men that she is functionally in the thrall of,
And to get back to the idea of like, red pill and Jordan B. Peterson fraud, a lot of it, like it just strikes me also how, if you're going to make these kinds of arguments about feminine wiles and whatnot, a lot of it just strikes me as just kind of, it's a classical thing of like, what we think of as conservatism is not really that anymore, right? It's like a very weird form of right-wing extremism that's not even classically, psychologically conservative. Like, if you have like feminine wiles and you fall prey to them, well, I mean, that's on you as a man, isn't it? Right? Why are you not, why are you, because Antony, obviously he knows what's going on, but he still gives into it. I
And
remember
everyone,
like
all the Romans basically mock him mercilessly for this.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
just talk
And
about like like how whipped he is and like how pathetic it is as well
yeah.
throughout like,
Happened
the
to
whole
Pompey the
mathematic.
Great too. Pompey the Great was married to Julius Caesar's daughter Julia, and apparently they had a rather loving relationship,
Mhm.
which was unusual for like basically in Rome. If you were a powerful person, you had a wife that you did not give a shit about, and then you had like a mistress or some sort of twink off on the side that was the person that you actually had some sort of, more powerful romantic attachment to. But to publicly be in love with somebody that you were attached to was like considered rather humiliating, and that is an interesting like older form of right wing, which is like, look, you as a man, like you're like being attached to a woman at all in public where we can see it, like that's pretty sus, man.
Mhm.
That's you should really want to spend like 98% of your time with the boys, doing masculine stuff like
I mean,
virtually.
honestly, like reading some of this stuff now, well, I mean, I read it back then, but it didn't quite hit me then. But rereading it now and just like thinking back to my life, I remember one time like dating a woman that, like I remember like the summer passed and I was thinking like, fuck, like the whole summer I barely did any reading. I wasn't really writing at the time, but like I barely did any reading. I barely did anything, and like 2 months passed and I'm going back to college, and what the hell did I get out of it? Like, I'm so disgusted with myself. I need to stop seeing her. Like it was like that kind of thing. But like, the disgust with myself, it was not like, oh, this fucking like, like she's just trying to like get like, no, it's like you were supposed to be doing this. You were supposed to be reading. You were supposed to be, like spending the summer wisely because you don't like to be in classes, and you had these 2 months where you could do it, and instead you fell into this hellhole of delirium and kind of like just like self-titillation, right? It's pointless, and that
Hormones.
yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like you're supposed to be aware of that on your own. Like when I see anything like about feminine wildness not being pushed, it's like you're such a fucking pussy. Like just shut up. You should be the one controlling yourself. Like
But like just to bring it back, like actually to the play, like I think there's like an interesting thing aspect that ties into that I was thinking, where it is sort of like it's interesting because it is like a love plot, but they're both two middle-aged people. If you like just even going by like a more conservative estimate of their ages, like Mark Antony is presented in it as being older in years because like there's continual references to like Octavius Caesar as being like a boy and
mhm,
of like barely having a beard yet and all these kinds of things in contrast to him. And then like like on Cleopatra's part, like then there's these references to her being still young, assume be a teenager or a young woman when like she seduced Julius Caesar. So you'd assume now like enough time, a couple of decades maybe have passed. Like she's probably going to be what, in her 40s, he's in his 50s or so. And it's like it does add an interesting aspect. I feel like I haven't watched any adaptations because I couldn't find anyone's like online that were of decent quality to like actually watch. But it seems like there's been at least some that have kind of leaned into that quality of it being like sort of this, rather than being like it does add something too, because you can't even kind of like you're saying your example, like chalk it down to like, oh, you're young, we've all been in college or young and you have like those kind of first love experience, you're supposed to grow out of it. But I think there's this like added interest in this whole plot about the fact that they're like both two older people. They have a history, they have all this behind them, and like they're still kind of acting in this very puppy love kind of way.
He's David Brooks.
Hmm?
There's this conservative op-ed writer here in America named David Brooks, who very famously left his wife and married like a young research assistant, and he wrote this book called The Second Mountain, which was apparently overflowing with him being like a 50, 60 something guy who has gloriously rediscovered sex and is talking about love and passion and all that kind
I mean,
of
that is
that's
so
honestly like some of the scenes in
embarrassing.
this, like you could, depending on like clever casting choices, you could very easily, that's exactly the impression you'd give off from it. Like,
Mhm.
and it kind of
yeah.
does add something because it's one thing to have this sort of like, little games they're playing between them and, all this, like when you imagine it being as young people, but like, kind of thinking of people in their 40s or 50s acting this way, and it really gives a different impression. Like, I gotta say, like, it does, like it or not to say like you're not allowed to have your puppy love bullshit, but like when you add in the aspect of the irresponsibility of it all, it kind of just
Well, but when you see, I mean, I think this aspect is sometimes overstated when critics talk about it, but there is a certain like austerity and matter-of-factness to the scenes that take place in Rome, you don't get a sense that there's a lot of room for passion. So, I mean, this might be the first time in his life that he's been exposed to this kind of like passionate life of the senses, as opposed to the life of brutality and of the mind or whatever, like he's having this very teenage kind of experience as an older guy, because it just wasn't something that he had access to in his younger years. So I mean, that is just, it's interesting to think about. And that's, I think, also to some extent, like the point of the play is like, this is really something that you should have gotten out of your system when you were a younger dude. Like,
but he never did. He never did. His entire life was just that, right? He just kept accumulating new lovers, new this, new that. Like that's the thing. That his problem was that he's incapable of getting out of his system. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's just like it's also like adds on like the Cleopatra side of things. I think like it's that aspect that adds this like frisson of like ambiguity and ambivalence to her character too, because it's not like she's this like at one point I have it somewhere here. I think it's in Act 3 or something. She's there talking about her previous affairs with Julius Caesar and I think with Pompey, his son, or thing I believe is Pompey. Anyways, he's just referred to in the play, and like she's talking about her affairs, and she's like explicitly contrasting this with the supposed genuine love she now has with Mark Antony, and that like that these were these things of her learning how to, I guess, manipulate and learning how to seduce in this way, but this is different somehow,
Well, it's funny
so I feel like it adds to that though, because there is this ambiguity, especially with the way how we very consciously see her manipulating him, like on the text, and we also then see her how quick she is to like turn tail when it's in favor to her, like and curry favor with the Romans. So like it does kind of offer, it's a bit different than if maybe like this was like a 20-year-old Cleopatra. Like this is like a middle-aged woman who's very knows how to play with her sexuality, knows how to knows her effect on men and knows what to do with that, and it does give it adds to that ambiguity there, and I think it gives our character a little more depth, I think, and gives an actress more to play with than you would have if,
Well, the interesting thing is, because so much of this is basically a survival strategy on her part, it's kind of open, like how much of this is even conscious on her part, because at one point early on, she talks about Julius Caesar, I never loved him like this. And one of her handmaids is off to the side is like, well, you weren't saying that back then. And she's like, shut up. And then at some point in the middle of the play, she's like, I guess I was kind of talking shit about Caesar more than I should have, like there is like,
I think it's like that's in like the next scene or something as well. Like,
at some point she has like a moment of self-awareness, like, but then that kind of, falls away, and you never even know like who is making what decision in this play. Like, it's not entirely clear to me that like Fulvia's rebellion against Octavius, that Antony was even in on it, like he might have genuinely had nothing to do with it. And then when the Egyptians turn on Antony near the end, like, did Cleopatra actually tell them to do like, that, or was that like an underling that had turned tail?
It's left very, and I think that's actually like there's a lot of ambiguities like that are like that's one of the details with the Egyptians. I have to go back and look at it a second. I'm like, wait, hang on, and it's like it is left very unclear because of her reaction then, where you could play it both ways depending on, I think like this is another one of the things compared to some of Shakespeare's plays. There's a lot of now I don't know a lot about directing or the process, but I feel like there's a lot of things where you're left a certain amount of creative control as a director to kind of play it. You could say to your Cleopatra, right, Cleopatra was totally in on this, and then that would lead you then to play the scenes where she decides to manipulate him, to hide in the monument, to pretend she died, in a very different way than if you kind of were to decide to play as it's her underling betraying her, because later she does have her treasurer betray her essentially in front of the Romans. So there's like validity of playing it that way either, but like either way it's going to like offer a very different view of the character. There's a lot of, and like it would kind of work either way, which is like something I don't think you get that in like a lot of like it's been a while now since I've read like a lot of other I went on my big Shakespeare binge and read kind of a lot of stuff, but like I don't think that sort of like open-endedness is something you get so much in a lot of his plays.
Well,
So
you
it's
get
quite
open-endedness with certain performative aspects, like if you're
yeah.
doing Hamlet, if you're playing Hamlet, is he like, how crazy is he? How much of
Yeah,
it
but I
is
feel like
or
that
how
doesn't have
to,
such a massive
yeah.
bearing on
Yeah,
like
no,
the
no, well,
meat
and
of things as
yeah,
this
well,
does.
this play has a lot of that too. Like what one scene we haven't even talked about, but I actually think is aesthetically, like I could see this being one of the first things that gets cut, but aesthetically, it's one of the more fascinating parts of the play. There's this scene of all the soldiers. There's none of the main characters, anybody around. All the soldiers are just sitting around in camp, and suddenly there's like this noise that starts playing that none of them can
Oh
identify,
yeah.
and none of them has any idea what it is. And one of them's like, well, I guess that's Hercules abandoning Antony's cause or whatever. But it's like, it's not, I mean, the thing that in the description, it says houseboys, which is an old-timey term for oboes. So they're just sitting around, this military camp, and suddenly there's just this sound of you could use oboes, but it could be, I mean, you could do, if you were performing it, you could do anything with that. And what exactly that means, I mean, you get one person's interpretation of it, but it's this weird dip into like almost magical or like fantastical element that kind of comes out of nowhere and is not really commented on again. And yet when I was reading this time, it really had like it stuck out to me as like aesthetically at least like somewhat important, because the whole theme of the play is basic, or not theme, like motif or construction or whatever, is that you really don't get your bearings and kind of understand what is happening and who is doing why at a lot of
Yeah,
points.
it's like,
And
I feel like that aspect, like that scene is an interesting one as well. And I just think it's that aspect that actually does make it oddly modern, because
yeah.
I mean, not to say that like people in Shakespeare's time wouldn't have been like that this wasn't something that was a facet of how people interact with each other, how they interpreted, certain political decisions or whatever. But like, nowadays we're like so hyper conscious of like performing and of like reputation and of the difference between the image one projects versus the actual, and this kind of, obviously there's a social media aspect that is like, basically I'm probably at the upper end of the generation where like people are just constantly like swimming in this, like basically you have your persona and you have your actual self, and there's this waviness, like haziness between the two. And it's just like, I do think like it is, it maybe doesn't go about or explore a theme in a way that a modern writer would, but it like it's obviously very as conscious or as deliberate in playing around with that idea as somebody of Shakespeare's time probably could have been. And maybe that's partly why it didn't get as popular as well. Maybe like it's due for a bit of a renaissance, because I think that just stood out to me a lot. Like, I mean, there's a lot you can talk there in terms of like modern politics and that, like that aspect of it as well, like the smoke and mirrors kind of part of it.
Well,
like,
it kind of is how a modern
here.
writer would approach it, though, because the last act of the play is basically Cleopatra wrestling with herself, like, okay, I've been captured and I've been beaten. How am I going to play this?
And she's like outright. I'll actually get this and read this because it's one of the things I did note, that was like she has this kind of thing, being conscious of how she's going to be viewed by the world, and viewed when like Caesar's talking to her about like bringing her to Rome, and she's then handmaids that. So you have nay, 'tis most certain era, saucy lictors will catch at us like strumpets, and scald rhymers ballad us out of tune. The quick medians extemporally will stage us and present our Alexandrian revels. Antony shall be brought drunken forth, and I shall see some squeaking Cleopatra boy my greatness in the posture of a whore. And like it's kind of like it is quite meta in the sense that like she would have been played when this is initially done by some like boy actress, but like it's also like it also is quite like a literal, like she's very conscious. It is that almost narcissism coming out, which is, I feel like, is quite a modern thing of like, how can I frame this? How can I spin this? How is this going to be viewed? And it's like, it's not, she kind of like up until that point, she's like sort of thinking, how can I deal with this? How can I try and get this in my favor? And it's only when she realizes she won't be able to spin it in a way that like adds to her myth, adds to any of this, that she gives up entirely. And it's just like, then when she decides to kill herself, it's done in this very grand kind of way. Like, I have immortal longings in me. And it's,
you know, it's her final act of taking control of the narrative. And
yeah, well, and then she ends up taking her own life, and given the sort of sexuality and innuendo of the whole thing, I mean, it's not for nothing that it's a phallic sort of thing with which she takes her own life, and that is like enveloping her on her breasts, running down her arm, and also the and yet there's also that duality there, though, because I mean, this was a Christian society in which this is being written, and so the snake would be associated with the fall, with feminine weakness and whatnot, and yet here she is kind of reclaiming it as a way to sort of take this last little bit of her destiny that she has some sort of choice about into her own hands and go out on her own terms instead of being I mean, you have to imagine, like, just practically speaking, would there be anything more humiliating than being like someone who was great in their own society, and then you're marched in front of these like drunken, like awful Romans, like this horrible, like fireplace smoke going everywhere, choked city, and like trash in the streets everywhere, like not,
that is like a common that's the pretty common motif in the play, which I find because I mean we have like the ages of the people. So Cleopatra dies at age 39, so she's 39 here. We have Antony, who is at this point, I believe, in his 40s. Is he in his 40s, or did he die at 53? Well, it was one of those. The point is, right, he's like well into middle age, and one of the kind of like fascinating aspects is like all characters, Cleopatra as well as Antony, they're both seem to be like very concerned with not only like what they're going to be perceived as publicly, after their deaths, which actually I find it a breath of fresh air, because it seems like when we look at modern politicians, nobody's at all thinking about how are people going to perceive what I did now in the future, when it's like I don't have my accomplices with me, I don't have my flunkies with me, I just have literally history and time leveling everything. Like that's one of the reasons why I was like kind of just shocked how like Trump, like he didn't give a shit about doing anything well. Like he was like in a unique position to, try something, and he did almost nothing. And here they are, they're very concerned about this. And sometimes Antony, like one time he gets angry when he hears about the words of Octavius, and he says something like, I'm angry over the fact that he's so like he's criticizing me or something with or rather he's interpreting me with the way that I am, as opposed to who I was, right? It's almost as if like he's aware that he has these like past glories that he's never going to get back. Later on, there's this. Let me see if I could find as I'm talking about it, but like like
I think
chance.
it's the start of Act 4. I know the part you mean.
Yeah. So this is when he's getting angry, and he just feels himself like I deserve more, in the same way that Cleopatra says give me my robes and give me my crown. I have immortal longings in me. It's like immortal longings for what? Like in death, right? Like whatever that you did up until this point, that's all that you can do. You have these final moments. Make sure that whatever the perception is going to be in some ways positive, right? You need to have done something constructive in your life. It's not going to be enough for the propaganda to do it for you. And also the idea of like chance, right? This a sense of like things are very much out of our control. I mean, it's a very common like Greek tragedy trope, right? This idea of you can't fight against destiny, you can't fight against whatever that is coming. Right, Oedipus Rex, obviously, right? You try to like avoid the prophecies, and instead you get further and further enmeshed in these prophecies. So like Act 5, Scene 2, I think it is. Let me see, where basically they're talking about chance in a way that I think is very, very modern. What is line 145 or so? So Caesar says, "Take to you no hard thoughts. the record of what injuries you did us, meaning Caesar speaking to Cleopatra, right? When she's wondering, like, am I going to get killed, or like, what's going to happen to me? Take to you no hard thoughts, the record of what injuries you did to us, though written in our flesh, we shall remember as things but done by chance. And in many respects, like if you think about it, when you get to a high enough level of either like, military or political power, everybody is at that point pretty much reacting. They are reacting to kind of like almost like material reality at that point, right? Where it's just like pure cause and effect, right? When nation states go to war, there's like a pure kind of cause and effect. There's just a sense of like, whether it's rational or irrational, the perception as well. It's rational for me to feel, defensive here. So we need to, we need to commit a genocide. We need to do this. We need to do that. And here it's almost as if like Caesar he's kind of like almost like mature enough where he's able to recognize that at a high level, this is how politics and militaries are. No hard feelings. This is simply how, things play out.
Caesar is sort of the agent of fortune in this play. I mean, everybody keeps, I think they say early on, when it comes to my skill versus his good fortune, my skill is going to lose. I think Antony says something to that effect early on. And it's an interesting way to frame it, because ultimately, I mean, this is Octavius Caesar, it's fucking Augustus. Like, he's one of the most skilled politicians and leaders that Rome would ever have in its entire history. I mean, he basically built a system that lasted, almost 200 years after him, before the crisis of the 3rd century and the various civil wars that happened in that time, the temporary breakup of the empire, and then it's the replacement of the Principate with the Dominate under Diocletian. So it's interesting that someone who is like objectively as skilled as everybody like in history ever, except for maybe his patriarch Julius Caesar, at occupying a high seat of power and basically playing the keys of power perfectly, is here. Since I guess maybe since he's a young boy, he still is kind of finding his footing or whatever. It's just he's an instrument of chance, and yet at the same time, like, it's not really chance, because like, Antony, you're fucking around. Like, you have land dominance and you decide to fight him at sea because he like basically called you a pussy if you don't.
It's an ego. Yeah, it's
like
that's why I do think there is something, and it's anachronistic.
Like, it's not
there
like
is very something
very, is not.
There is something very like midlife crisis-esque about like the whole thing. Like, that's very anachronistic, but like you can't have kind of thinking it a bit, reading it in the 21st century. Like, it's, I don't know, you do have that like sense kind of, though, more seriously, of like, like, I guess it's just kind of that decadence. It's somebody being overtaken. Somebody's had their like their better days beyond them, and now they're taken. And it's just like, that's just kind of comes down to fortune and luck and chance and the way of the world, more so, because like it's bound to, like, regardless of the specific talents of Octavius, like there's going to be somebody there to overtake him, because his days are gone. Like,
Yeah. Well, and also just it is just interesting how like every character both like is and is not what they say they are. There is just this real ambiguity and ambivalence that basically everybody. I mean, I also just think I agree that in some ways this does feel the most modern of like any Shakespeare play that I can think of, which is not to say that it's the best, but it's sort of like when you watch a Hitchcock movie from like the 70s, where it's like, here's kind of maybe what he would have done if he'd been born a little bit later. And, it's not bad. It's actually quite interesting. It's got, some good parts. I probably...
it's like reading Shakespeare's sonnets, and I can't think of the numbers off the top of my head, but there's some that like aren't necessarily his best ones, but they do have a weirdly more modern feel to it. I can't, like, unfortunately, I can't think of the number. It's been a while since I've read them, but like, I do think, it's that kind of effect, really.
And there's this an Act 5 scene too, like, speaking of all the kind of dreams of the past, dreams of the future. So when Cleopatra tells the Dolabella, no matter, sir, what I have heard or known, You laugh when boys or women tell their dreams. Is it not your trick? Isn't that such a like modern line? Right. You
Yeah.
laugh when boys or women tell their dreams. And, boys and women being put, essentially in the same category here. But, the irony being, of course, that, Antony probably has all these dreams, and if not dreams, then at least fantasies of the past. Right. And he would be in that same category. Right. Perhaps the only one that might not be in this category is somebody like an Octavius. But like the play is full of these kinds of lines, and I thought that Act 3 ends perfectly. So this is like right at the end of scene 13, when Enobarbus tells about Antony, who's now has like second wind and he wants to go to war. He says, "Now he'll outstare the lightning." Speaking of Antony, "To be furious is to be frighted out of fear, and in that mood the dove will peck the estrage. And I see still a diminution of our captain's brain restores his heart. When valor preys on reason, it eats the sword it fights with. I will seek some way to leave him." Right, unexpected final line, and this whole idea of emotion versus the intellect. Okay, so I think it's time to transition to the patron show, and in the patron show that is patreon.com/automachination, or the YouTube membership program. You get access to that as well. And we're going to finish discussing Antony and Cleopatra. We're going to discuss the character of Enobarbus. We're going to, am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Yes.
Enobarbus? Yeah, Enobarbus. For some reason, I thought there was a D in there. But anyway, we're going to discuss him as a character. I want actually Laura to flesh out what she said earlier about the whole thing about it's not exactly clear, right? It's a very ambivalent, right, in terms of is Cleopatra in fact in love with Antony? Because I think depending on how you break that question down, it's kind of interesting how it might be interpreted over the centuries up until the modern day. And of course, right, any patron show, we're going to be discussing everything else that might be on our minds, whether it's current events or literature that we're reading, things that we're watching, so on and so forth. So for everybody that has watched thus far, thank you for being a viewer. And for the patrons, the patron show begins now.